I'm going to talk about, as I said, things that are happening in our grid. Quick disclaimer, I guess, here. This is Southern Cal Edison. We're a large utility serving about a third of the state of California, about 15 million residents or 50,000 square miles. I mentioned one thing there. We were top rated utility in the country last year for energy storage, for the amount of new energy storage that we're bringing on to help support our grid, and tying in with what our earlier speakers were talking about. So in 2020, it's been a weird year. Everything's happening. It seems like people talk about the new normal. Well, obviously the new normal seems to be that things can change faster and faster every year. This year, we obviously had a world-changing event, the pandemic. We also had extreme weather in California, which impacts our grid and our customers. We have some progress towards a cleaner grid, including more distributed energy resources, or DERs. And then as a couple of our speakers have talked about, EVs and the expansion of the EV markets are a big deal, including a large part of our future here. So, you know, just to briefly touch on something that'll go down in history, obviously, for the scale of it. What happened to our grid? Did the pandemic impact us? Well, of course it did. The customer impacts, you know, the people in Southern California, of course, or all over the country, were impacted. Thousands of deaths. We have close to 900,000 cases of COVID in California. And in early March, that resulted in a sort of an immediate shutdown, a kind of a economic shutdown that we've never experienced in most of our lifetimes. That led to an economic recession, led to people losing their jobs. Frankly, think of all the businesses, you know, that have closed down or even gone out of business. And that in turn had impacts on the grid. So real quick, what happened to our grid? Well, dramatically literally within the first week or two of the governor's stay-at-home orders and that realization societal wide that this was a major issue in early March, the demand dropped. And as one of our earlier speakers shared, the demand did not drop evenly. It dropped more significantly in commercial, industrial, not surprisingly, right? Factories closed, shopping malls closed, stores and offices closed, and the demand went up in our residential sector. And that's because more people were staying at home, they were working from home, they were quarantined. And the overall net effect was a net reduction. It was more significant in the initial weeks, and now it's been tapering back up. So as we've been in this situation 7 months now, our demand has crept back up. We're still at SCE, slightly below the pre-COVID levels, and there's been some weather adjustment because we've had a hot summer. California ISO, which is the system operator that operates our grid here in California, has a website with some real interesting information. If you're a data geek and you want to get into it, they have a number of pages here. They do an update every week, but they also have a monthly update. This mentions what I just suggested. The first week, there were some dramatic drops. Over time, it's trended up. Interestingly, you'll see down near the the bottom part of the page, in the early pandemic, the prices were impacted too. On kind of spot pricing, day ahead market pricing were impacted because demand had dropped. So it shows you what a big impact something like this can have on our markets. There was no real impact to grid reliability overall from the pandemic. There were concerns about would the utilities, for example, be able to keep up the grid? And the short answer is yes, we were able to. We did have employees that were basically categorized as essential workers, just like in other sectors of the economy, to keep the grid going. And so we haven't had any challenges there. Here's a couple graphs, because we all love graphs. The first or second week of the pandemic here in late March, you can see the red scale or the blue line is sort of the expected daily grid load or maximum grid load, amount of energy and power being used on the grid. The red line shows what actually happened, and there's some significant drops there. Over time, as I said, that has moderated. This is 2 months ago. If you looked at it now in October, it would be even more normal. This is statewide. Our SCE model is a little different, but it's quite similar. So here's kind of the important thing. The grid load had temporary impacts, probably not a long-term impact from that. There were a couple of technology, notes that people saw during this. Number one, I think, was under appreciated, if you will. Huge sections of the workforce went to work from home, and that will have all kinds of long-term impacts. Of course, that'll have long-term impacts, sociologically and maybe on business models, home delivery and all that. But I would argue it also may have impacts on technology development, where people are coming up with different solutions to help make remote working more palatable, more successful, faster. You have the Zoom model, you have all these other things too, including some we probably haven't even thought of. This situation's been running 7 months now. And, at this point, we're not real sure how soon it's going to be over, right? And so that does lead to concerns, of course, for the economy long term, but it also may lead to technology solutions. I'll give you a second simple example. At Southern Cal Edison, we at any time have large numbers of projects. They might be technology demonstration projects through our emerging technologies, or they may be our normal customer projects in our energy efficiency programs. We did not want those to come to a grinding halt for a period of time, like they did for a short time after the stay at home. So we switched from in-person inspections at the end of a project to virtual inspections. And there's different tools now available for that, but it's an example of technology adaptation to this kind of situation. We're back to normal, quote unquote, now in terms of our project life cycles, where we're able to inspect at the end of the projects, most of the time virtually, such that we're not exposing people to the same level of risk that they would have otherwise been. Here's a second part in kind of that was short term, the COVID situation. Medium term is what I would call what we're going through right now. California has a much higher wildfire risk today than we did a few years ago. We have had record heat and fires. The utilities, including SCE, the last couple of years have switched over to a model called PSPS, or Public Safety Power Shutoff, where we proactively shut power down in certain regions if there's an elevated fire risk, and particularly high winds that could cause problems with the grid. We also have a longer term grid hardening plan, and it's actually a 10-year plan. We're in about somewhere between 2 and 3 years into it. Here's a little more detail. You guys, of course, saw the media. Everybody's going crazy because our heat levels are continuing to rise, and long term, that could be a real challenge in a lot of sectors. Obviously has some immediate challenges for us. 132 degrees in Death Valley is pretty bad, but I would argue 120 degrees in Northridge or Burbank's just about as bad, right? We've had 8,500 wildfires statewide, 31 people dead. And here's the part I think is hard for most people to grasp, 4 million acres burned. So most of those areas in our modern society, if you're closer to the population centers, there are electric grid facilities there as well that could be impacted. So, what's our grid hardening? I mentioned we have a number of programs underway that all together fold up into a integrated process trying to make the grid more resilient long term, and that includes some technology solutions. We're covering a lot of the electrical conductor that historically has just been bare wire, is now being replaced with coated wire, and we've done a lot of mapping with analysis showing where are the highest fire danger areas, coinciding with our power lines, and those are the targeted areas, obviously. And to date, we've covered about 20%. So we have crews that are out there every day around the clock, including through the COVID, continuing to work on miles and miles of these covered conductor replacements. The covered conductors, of course, are insulated, and therefore they're more resistant to, say, a branch or something damaged from a high wind. We also are replacing poles. The vast majority of the poles out there are wood poles, which of course are at fire risk. We're replacing some of them with steel. We also have some research going on composite materials, poles that are made of different materials, to test their applicability. There's always, of course, cost trade-offs and installation and longevity and all those kinds of issues that you look at with any new technology. We're using sensors and kind of recloser technology to be able to isolate sections of the grid more quickly. So a couple of years ago, if we had a fire risk and we had to take a line out of service, it might also take out 50,000 customers or something. We've been segmenting the grid using these technology pieces of hardware such that we can only shut down smaller sections of the grid at a time. The result is we can still defend ourselves against the fire in the sense that wherever the immediate risk is, we can shut the power down there, but we're not shutting down nearly as many customers, which, you know, today we're very dependent on electrical power for everything, for our Zoom meeting here and our phones and our refrigerators. And we also have more people working at home. So we know it's a big imposition. So we're trying to minimize that number of customers that are shut off, and it's been much more successful this year than last year as a result of putting in more of these sensors. We're using drones. You guys know all about drones. There's been a movement in the utility industry for a few years, and it's now accelerating. Here's a photo of a little drone that is using video type surveillance capabilities to help us inspect our lines. And we still use helicopters for a lot of this. We even use fixed wing aircraft for some of this, but the drones are allowing us to do it now in areas that are a little tougher, and including in some urban areas where, you know, flying the helicopter along the edge of a street is not a great practice for customer, you know, happiness. So the drones not only have the video capabilities, but they have some smart intelligence now involved where they can identify from the data stream potential hardware glitches, which we then follow up on. If, you know, if they identified looks like a loose insulator or a loose connection, we would then follow up with an in-person visit. This gives us a lot more capabilities. We've also installed several hundred weather stations throughout our service territory so that we can model and monitor things on a very localized scale instead of, you know, looking at, okay, it's going to be hot tomorrow in Southern California. Well, okay, great. That's 30,000 square miles. We know that within a very small zone, what some of the specifics are. We also have added video cameras on upwards of several hundred towers. And these video cameras are helping us and the fire authorities monitor for wildfires. And they have monitoring, some of them are 24/7, where they also have machine vision type technology where they can identify what looks like smoke and then alert an operator. So we don't have to have an operator sitting there, you know, trying to watch 600 screens or 600 channels. They can get alerted to it by a software. And as part of all this, tying it all together, the company has invested in more weather sophistication. We installed a couple sort of supercomputers to help us with weather modeling. We hired kind of a preeminent expert in weather and fire behavior. And now we're able to do some identification of weather conditions, like I said, in a very localized area, which allows us to then send a crew out to that area if needed, rather than, again, say, gee, it's hot and windy in Santa Barbara today. Maybe we say, you know, the Painted Cave area has a condition. We should go send a truck out there to make sure what's going on. So one final thing, that's just an example because we got some technology fans in the audience here. The markets tend to react to this too. Here's an example. The aerospace industry has come up with the world's largest firefighting helicopter, and SE recently signed a deal to help pay for it. With the Orange County Fire Authority, we paid for the lease. This thing can drop 3,000 gallons of water or retardant in a single pass. It also can see at night, which most helicopters are reluctant, as you know, to fly in the dark or in the smoke. This one can do that, and it's available for use throughout Southern California, on the normal kind of joint support. So longer term, I wanted to mention several things. This ties in here with what you heard all of our earlier speakers talking about. State of California has some very ambitious goals. We're going to get to, 50 or 80% reduction on our carbon emissions by the year 2050. To get there, we have to make a lot of changes. You all saw the different graphs here. Here's a stacked bar graph showing GHG, but very similar to the pie charts you saw before. The big actors here that have to be impacted are transportation, electric power generation, industrial, residential, commercial, and ag are also big, but they're not in the same scale. So this was a white paper we issued in 2017. We were targeting this sort of 2030 goal. We said, here's some things we have to do to get started. In the last couple of years, we've come to the realization that those long-term goals are so large, we've kind of made some changes. So this was our original, and I won't go through these because these numbers are a little bit out of date now, but how to reduce our GHG by 2030. You can see all the sectors we just talked about: transportation, generation, and then customer behavior, both industrial and commercial, and ag. For us at Edison, there's three main targets. Obviously, number one, we're a big electric user. We do some of our own generation, but we actually buy the majority of it now from outside third-party independent folks. And we want to decarbonize that so we can hit our long-term goal of carbon-free electricity. EVs, as you heard several of our speakers mention, this is California. We have more vehicles registered here than anywhere in the country, and they do provide a huge target. And then buildings, as Igor was just mentioning, sometimes this gets overlooked, I think, by the general public. Of course, we're starting on the residential sector for obvious reasons, but longer term, the bigger opportunities are in building electrification on the commercial, industrial, residential. So we redefined our goal to a longer term 2045. And here, here it is, basically carbon neutrality by 2045, and the retail electric supply would be 100% decarbonized. We break that out into sectors. Here's our 100% decarbonized electric. Here's our buildings, 70%. Here's the 75% that Celia and one of the other speakers talked about for transportation, as well as a couple others that these are outside our realm here, but carbon sink. So on our grid, what are we doing about that? We're continuing to purchase more electricities. Sorry, that was SCE. This year, we're up above over 40% on our RPS, or our renewable portfolio. 40% or more of our power is clean energy on our grid. And each year that climbs as we sign more of these long-term power contracts. In California, as you guys know, a lot of those are both wind, large-scale wind and large-scale solar, as well as the increasing amounts of distributed solar and some other distributed generation resources. A big important component of that, of course, is adding storage. As Rafael was talking about, and as John mentioned and Mark mentioned, we need a lot more storage in California to get to our goal, to balance the intermittency, to balance some of the other shifting that comes on with using so much renewables. So we've been signing some long-term power contracts. At the same time, our customers here on the sort of the DER side, our customers are continuing to add solar, as they have been for a number of years. Storage is climbing. The price points of storage have come down something like 2/3 in the last 5 years, including on the residential sector. So that's having an impact. And then EVs, of course. So here was the power grid. As I mentioned, here's a few numbers, just because we like numbers here. Even though we're in this COVID situation, by the way, this year in 2020, the forecasting agencies are expecting a record volume this year. Part of that's, of course, because a lot of projects have been in place now for several years, and they're coming to fruition. They're being commissioned.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah.
I think you need to kind of, if you can sort of maybe wrap up or
Got it. Okay. So completing the thought there, I just wanted to mention, at Edison, we do a lot of work on research on applied, demonstrations of technologies. A big focus for us today is building electrification, as I mentioned, and then transportation electrification. So I'll close with one thing I wanted to mention here. For EVs, consumers are buying them, but as our previous speaker and Celia pointed out, a large opportunity here is in medium and heavy duty transportation. So we're going to need millions of vehicles, if you can see by some of these charts, to make a difference. Millions of electric vehicles. We're expanding the infrastructure both for light duty charging and heavy duty charging. We're doing that by putting in large numbers of chargers. We have a kind of a classic utility public partnership where we're going to approved recently to put in 38,000 new chargers that'll help people charge light vehicles. And then we have an entirely separate infrastructure for heavy duty. So we call it our charge ready transport. We've put out equipment, information for our customers showing there are hundreds actually of vehicles available now. We can, provide information to our customers on what they are, how they work. And I expect that there will be a significant uptake. There are challenges on the medium and heavy duty vehicle side today, as you heard earlier. Number one is price point. Number two is general education for the buyer. And then number three would be the charging infrastructure. It will take time, and it'll put a demand on the grid. And I did want to close with this. People always ask this question. It's a great question. If you're electrifying all these buildings and you're electrifying all this transportation, will we have enough power to do this? Short answer is yes. It's being ramped up kind of slowly now, and we'll have opportunities with storage and new resources to help mitigate that. But overall, long term, it will be a major impact, and we're expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of a 60% increase in power demand in the next 15 years or so to accommodate this, and that'll require a lot of long-term planning. At the same time, we're keeping the grid, affordable for the customers every day and reliable. So I close with the quote here: the evolution of the grid being modified like that has been described as rebuilding the airplane when it's in flight. So thank you, and if we have any questions.
All right, that's a very interesting quote to finish the presentation. I would like to ask the audience to type in if they have any questions for Gary. We're a little bit behind schedule, so we're going to take one question. Are there any questions from our panelists, perhaps?
Gary, I was one program I particularly like. I guess it's CPUC funded. I'm not sure who's funding it, but for people with either health issues or pumps or things like this, but subsidizing the storage so you can turn power lines off in wildfires. That's a great advance. Is it good? How long does that continue, or is that?
That's a relative. Great question, John. That's a relatively new program, an example where the state, the PUC in this case, has authorized the utilities to offer special programs like that, where we're targeting our residential customers to add more storage. That helps for a more balanced grid, but also more resilient if we have to turn power off in areas during wildfires. And to John's question, we have some special offerings for certain customers that meet criteria, either income criteria or they have medical needs, things like that, where we're offering an additional incentives. So we have incentives already for residential consumers to put storage in at the home level, but we've expanded that in this special case. Currently, I think that's maybe a 2 or 3 year program. I'd have to double check, John, but it is currently offered for customers to take advantage of. So people that have special conditions can get an additional dollar incentive to help buy down the cost of storage. Storage for home systems is still expensive today, but the uptake's been significant in the last year or two. And I think that kind of offering will help make it more. Obviously, there's more public awareness today in the last 2 years because we've had such a bad wildfire situation. And, honestly, we can expect it's going to continue that way for a few years till some of these grid remodelings are done. The climate changes obviously long term. The fires are going to be long term, and we have to adapt to it.